Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
It's great to have you. I've read so many of your books, remarkable, and they really helped me during my studies. Just for the sake of the audience, would you be able to just give a little bit of a background of what you do?
Well, I've been a professor of several different things. My PhD is in political science, but prior to that, I did graduate work in international studies and also in religion. So I've been looking at religion and politics most of my career, and with a focus on India, where I've lived for several years. I was teaching for a while at Punjab University and have come to love South Asia in general, and many times going to Pakistan as well as India. And then as a faculty member, I've been at Berkeley for some 15 years, and then I was a dean at the University of Hawaii, and then at the University of California at Santa Barbara, where I've been for the last 20 years or so. And now I'm in sort of retirement. I kind of flunked retirement in that I'm still seeing graduate students. I also seeing undergraduate. I teach a course at Claremont McKenna College near where we live in Palm Springs half the year. And the other half of the year we live in here in Maui in Hawaii, which is enjoying the gentle breezes and then working on our books. My wife is also an academic, so the two of us just hunker down. And people say, "What are you going to do in Hawaii? There's nothing to do." And we say, "Yes, that's right."
Yeah, that sounds so great. Really sounds brilliant.
We can work on our book.
Yeah. Also, Professor, when we actually were planning to meet last week and didn't work out for one reason or the other, and at the time we were going to speak about Palestine, but so much has happened in Syria that's going to happen.
Yes.
So in some ways, I think it worked out for the good, because I think I would have had to trouble you again for this episode right now. So would you like to talk a little bit about, so basically on the 27th of November, from then, things started turning around in Syria very quickly. There was like what they're calling as armed rebels movement from Idlib went and took over Aleppo and then Homs, Hama, and then Damascus very quickly. So within 2 weeks, the Assad government was toppled. Assad has left the country, and now we are where we are. What are your thoughts?
Well, my head is spinning like everyone else's. Everyone sort of expected and hoped, of course, that the really cruel regime of Bashar al-Assad would fall sooner or later. But I don't think anybody expected it to happen quite so quickly. And for this group, which has been in power up in Idlib, to have gained force and just swept down with little or no resistance. I mean, that's the amazing thing. It's kind of the way in which the Taliban swept into Kabul and took over Afghanistan. Sometimes the collapses of governments can happen very quickly when it appears that there's a vulnerability. And in this course, of course, the case, of course, the vulnerability was enhanced by the fact that the main supporters of Syria, Hezbollah and Lebanon and Russia and Iran, all were weakened for different reasons, in part because the attacks of Israel on Hezbollah and also on Iran, and Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine. So Bashar al-Assad was kind of left on his own. And it turned out left on his own, he didn't have much to support him. And the amazing thing is how the Syrian army just kind of scattered like crazy. And that's understandable. The same thing happened, with the Afghan army and when the Taliban moved into power. If it looks like you're going to lose, if you're a soldier, you're not going to hang around and wait to be killed. You're not going to be the last person standing. And so they literally sometimes just, took off their uniforms and ran out in their underwear, wherever they were, to escape. And now many of them are going over the border, although, the al-Shura has said that he would give clemency to any former soldiers, although not clemency to anybody actually involved in the terrorism and the brutality and the execution of tens of thousands of Syrians who were persecuted by Bashar al-Assad. So here we are now wondering what's going to happen next. And in the interim, of course, the government, such as it is, has a lot of stuff to do. It has to hold the country together. It has to start building up the frameworks for a governmental structure. It has to assure the minority communities that it's not going to persecute or marginalize them. So it's trying to do a lot of stuff really quickly. And of course, in the meantime, all around its borders, its neighboring countries and groups are taking interest. Islamic State is trying to regroup on the east. The Kurds are trying to maintain their support in the eastern part of Syria. Turkey is trying to move into the north. Israel moving into the south. So it's a busy time for Syria.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's going to take a bit more time for things to clarify. I think there's still a lot of fog of war. Um, so, from a Russian point of view, I was speaking with some people, and they were saying that basically Russia was absolutely ready to back Assad in this situation. They were getting the troops ready, but they were also getting, I forget the name of the mercenaries who are based in Africa. They were getting ready to get them over to Syria.
Oh, the Wagner Group?
Sorry?
The Wagner Group?
Wagner Group, absolutely. So they were absolutely ready to carry on defending Assad. But there were two things happened. Firstly, the Assad army started retreating so quickly,
Right.
one kind of base after the other. And then secondly, they didn't actually invite Iran or Russia for help, which was kind of bizarre. So in that situation, Russia decided that basically is if the Syrians themselves are not standing and fighting for it, then how can we try to do anything? So at that stage, I think personally, I think they made a wise decision. If they had got into it, it would have got really messy for the Russians and Iranians. So I think they kind of did the best that's on that as well. So put together, there are about 20,000 men altogether who are now going to be governing a population of almost 20 million. But even in the 20,000 people that they had, although they're called as rebels, they're labeled as rebels, a lot of them are not actually Syrian. They're coming from China, they're coming from Central Asia. So it's going to be interesting to see how the actual Syrian population, once the dust settles, how they see everything.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's some indications. You can certainly see how the HDS has ruled in Idlib. You know, they have after all, been in charge of a group, a territory, which is, in some ways has done very well. Idlib in some ways has thrived economically, although there was huge opposition to what they regarded as the authoritarian rule of al-Julani, which is the previous name that al-Shara has adopted. Uh, and then he recanted. Interestingly, he didn't come down hard. He didn't do a Bashar al-Assad and try to destroy everybody. He kind of retreated and said, "Okay, will will be nicer, and not imprison so many of his critics," which is, of course, one of the accusations they gave. But he certainly has an authoritarian streak. There's no question, and of course, there's a whole background of his relationship with al-Nusra, and before that ISIS, and before that Al Qaeda in Iraq when he was in Iraq. So he has a whole, background of being associated with hardcore jihadist groups. Although he has claimed to be more moderate and renounced that, and certainly right now his attention is simply on the unification of Syria and trying to deal with all of these extremely important practical problems. And maybe this will continue to occupy him, and ideology will be in the background. We'll see.
Um, I know you have a lot of experience in like first-hand interviews of Palestinian leaders, and your students have been looking into chat rooms and getting data together. Have you had a chance to look at like these movements that are based in Iraq and Syria, including HRT? What are their history, and what do you think is still their connection with ISIS? Are they two completely distinct groups now, or do you think they still have behind the scenes kind of the same people moving here and there?
Oh, well, they were fighting with each other after they broke up. You mean HTS and and ISIS. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, there was a very bitter breakup when well, both sides were trying to incorporate the other. They had this command from Zawahiri that there shouldn't be two Al Qaeda
yeah,
affiliates in Syria. They had to combine in some way, and of course, neither one wanted to be subservient to the other. And ISIS tried to take over Al Nusra, and ISIS also complained Al Nusra was trying to take over it. and,
yeah,
and that's where both groups broke with Al Qaeda
yes,
because they thought they'd be better off by themselves. But they then literally fought with each other. So there's no love lost between ISIS and Al Nusra in the background. And right now, of course, ISIS is creating a lot of problems in the east, trying to take over territory. And apparently they set up a bomb in Homs just a few days ago. So they are now one of the enemies of the current regime. So there's no love lost with ISIS. Now this doesn't make Al Nusra and now in its current formulation HTS. And of course, there are other groups also associated with HTS. It's not solely Al Nusra, but Al Nusra, the old Al Nusra still, that's the core of the movement.
yeah.
They claim to have become much more moderate and much more concerned about practical issues, and they even changed the name to reflect the liberation of all Syria rather than one that's more ideologically hardcore jihadist. But having said that, there is still, there is this kind of Islamic rhetoric and of course a strong jihadi past. So we just don't know how this is going to manifest itself ultimately once the dust is settled and there's a secure government and there are secure borders and there's some stability in the country, inshallah, which may or may not happen. We'll see.
Yes.
But if all that happens, then the question is, how are they going to rule? And then we look at Idlib as kind of an example of what they did there. And there is certainly an authoritarian streak and a fairly, religiously conservative one.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
if you're trying to figure out, are they going to be the Taliban? Are they going to be they're going to be like Iran, or are they going to be like Hamas, or maybe some sort of moderate form of those? They're certainly not going to be. Ashar has already said he's not going to limit what women have to wear, for example, and that's of course very important for Syrian society, which is traditionally not very hardcore Islamist, as you know. So that's some comfort. It's also assured Christians and Alawites and Druze, major minority groups, that they will be treated with respect and not. He was preserving the Shia shrine, for example, in the south of Syria, which is very important. So he's made all the right gestures, but we just don't know what the long run is going to look like.
It was quite strange to have like a man who's been designated as a terrorist by United Nations, apart from all individual countries, but who has a $10 million bounty on his head, being interviewed by CNN.
Right. And it was jailed by the Americans in Iraq at Camp Bucca. He's had a whole history of activism and confrontation with the West. So
I think the parallels that you draw between Afghanistan are very apt. I think I was thinking about the same thing, the way the army just kind of pulled away and just dissolved, and how alliances change very rapidly. It's actually the kind of things that we see in Afghanistan. They used to say you can you can rent an Afghan, but you can't buy him. So I think we're going to see some of those similar things. I also think Julani's movement alone obviously isn't going to be able to control all of Syria by themselves, but there are so many competing factions that even with all their kind of support behind all these movements, even the US, Turkey, they couldn't really get all of these movements to see eye to eye, whether that is HRT, or whether that's obviously we've got ISIS and we've got like the Kurds, um, the different minority groups. So I think it's going to be interesting. We're going to see probably even more splinter groups coming up as time goes by. Um, so how do you see things kind of stabilizing with that, and also with external influence? Because all the regional powers, so for example, um, clearly Qatar has its kind of sympathies for the Muslim Brotherhood type of movements, whereas Saudi Arabia really dreads and fears that movement. And then we've got Turkey, who doesn't want to see a Kurdish independent state, whereas America is backing the Kurds. They're both NATO allies. So it's going to be interesting how the different regional
They're
powers.
fighting with each other right now. The Turkish forces and Kurdish forces, and the Americans have tried to forge some sort of a ceasefire between the two. But you're absolutely right. This is a very, very tense time. And what will happen in the long run? That's really, the plan. They do have a plan. Is that the interim prime minister, al-Bashir, who's now part of the revolutionary group, and he's been designated as the interim prime minister through March of next year, and then they would form some kind of more stable kind of coalition government to administer for another year and a half or so before elections. And then what will happen with elections? Now, it all questions how, when this happened in Iraq, there was all this scrambling. I was in Iraq at the time, with the Baghdad University, meeting with people on the whole issue of the role of religion and a transition of government. And there were a lot of different political parties organized around, semi-Marxist, socialist, old Ba'ath kind of groups and labor unions and so forth. But very quickly, the politics turned towards religious associations and religious alignments. Different Sunni Shia groups in the south, of course, the majority of people in Iraq are Shia. But then, of course, in Al-Anbar region in the west, they were all Sunni, and then the Kurds in the north. So they would organize around ethnicity in the case of Kurds and religion in the case of Sunni and Shia. And my guess is the same thing will happen in Syria, in part because these religious alliances are the most easy to mobilize for political purposes.
Yeah.
If you're trying to create politics in a hurry, then, association with a religion is probably as easy a way to do that as any.
How do you
So,
see?
so this will mean then an electorate dominated by Sunni groups of various kinds, and then the question is what kind of protection for the minority groups. And my guess is that it will devolve into a more authoritarian rule than democracy usually indicates, in part simply for the stability of the country. And of course, this is what happened in Idlib, which is a much smaller region. But Julani ruled that pretty much like, I don't want to compare him with Assad, but he was certainly it was certainly an authoritarian rule. And he was accused of being like Assad by his critics and by the protests in the movement in Idlib. Now, I think he's learned from that experience. So he may not try to be quite as dogmatic and harsh for the whole of Syria, but my guess is that he will exert a pretty strong hand. It's not clear right now what his role is. I don't think he has a title other than, he's kind of de facto president, but we'll see what happens in the long run.
And what do you think is going to happen with the Kurds? Ultimately, do you see the US kind of throwing them under the bus, or do you think, because it's going to be hard to have a solution that satisfies Turkey and also gives the Kurds some kind of independence?
Well, Trump already did that during his last administration. He threw the Kurds under the bus. And my guess is the problem with Trump is that he is a profoundly ignorant man, and particularly when it comes to international affairs. And he has no idea really what he's doing. And he wants to kind of curry favor with strong people like Erdogan in Turkey. And so apparently it was just in a telephone call. He said, oh, we will we'll pull troops out of the north, and you can just move into that area if you want to. And so the Kurds are saying, "What? Wait a second." Uh, and and so my guess is that the same thing will happen right now in the fading days of the Biden administration. The Americans are trying to keep the Kurds from the Turkish forces from decimating the Kurdish regions. Um, but I God knows what will happen under the Trump administration.
Yeah.
And particularly have some clown like that he's proposing as defense secretary.
Yeah.
Uh, it's not boding well for the Kurds, is all I can say. And their main concern, of course, there are Kurdish people living in the area, but also they are keeping ISIS from regrouping. They've been a major force. The Peshmerga has been the major force in destroying ISIS in that area of Iraq and Syria in the first place. So that was, of course, the Americans' concern, and that's the reason why there are 900 U.S. troops still there, protecting the Kurdish forces and also, protecting the prisons where ISIS leaders are held captive. Now, if Turkey moves in, Turkey doesn't have any desire to support ISIS, but if there's no longer American or Kurdish support of the prisons, well, those prisoners just take off, they regroup, and then Shira will have an even bigger problem on his hands trying to deal with ISIS in the east. And maybe he can come to some sort of a deal with them. But right now, I think he simply wants to defeat them militarily. If they're going to attack the way they did just recently in Homs, he's going to have to fight them.
I think you're absolutely right. That's just what I was thinking, that if first of all, it is a very volatile situation, and then on top of that, we're going to get a very volatile US president coming in. So anything could happen. But if Trump's administration does decide to kind of pull their hands from the backing of the Kurds, then I think they will probably end up leaving the country, maybe. Tell me what you think, because previously, obviously, Trump did try to leave Syria. So if they do leave Syria, I can just see that the forces from ISIS from Iraq, even Shia forces from Iraq, would probably try and enter the situation in Syria. And it'll be very difficult for anyone to stop the two countries fighting each other.
Yeah, but where are they going to go? I mean, they can flood into Kurdistan, which is already packed with refugees. I mean, Kurdistan by, northern Iraq. That's right now the only secure haven that the Kurds have, because they're certainly not going to be welcome in eastern Turkey at Diyarbakir, which is the other kind of Kurdish stronghold in eastern Turkey. And the Iranians are not all that friendly towards the Kurds in the northern part of their country. I mean, the Kurdish region is huge.
Yes.
Covering big sections of Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, as well as Syria. So, but in none of those places, except for that pocket in northern Iraq, which is, around Erbil, is there really a secure haven for the Kurds. Now, they could go to Germany. There are a lot of Kurds in Germany. That's where many of them from Turkey have migrated. And that's, of course, one answer. And the Germans are ambivalent about swarms of Kurds coming in. On one hand, it does need the labor, that's for sure. But on the other hand, there's a lot of public outcry as there is around the world against refugees coming in, and the kind of imagined problems that creates. These are mostly imagined problems. That really aren't very many problems. It's, I think, a net gain, but traditional societies don't see it that way.
Let me just take a moment's break to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is proudly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a e-commerce marketing agency specializing in making brands successful on Amazon. So if you are thinking of starting a new venture, or if you already have a brand and you want to take it to that next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. For transparency purposes, let me also tell you that WLC is actually a company that I founded and am the director of. When you get in touch with WLC, you'll be getting in touch with me and my team, and we look forward to greeting you and seeing how we can help. Thank you, and now let's get back to the episode. The Kurds are spread over a big geographical location, as you say, and wherever they are, it seems to be very oil rich. So I think that's why it's even more difficult for them to gain some kind of independence, because they're sitting on so much oil.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Also, how do you see Israel? Do you think Israel is going to go all the way to Damascus, or at some stage are they going to pull out? They seem to want buffer zones for their buffer zones, and then another buffer zone on top of that.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
The Israelis, do you think? Where do you think Israel is going to stop?
Yeah, well, Israel, of course, trying to move into the south. I mean, this is a big challenge for Shira. I mean, he took his nom de guerre, Julani, from a region in the Golan Heights where his family originally came from. So his family originally were in the area that is now occupied by Israel.
Wow.
And I'm sure he would love to retake that that area just out of family tradition.
Yeah.
He wasn't born there. He was, I think, actually born in Saudi Arabia because his father was kind of on the move. But there is this kind of family home in what is now Israel's Golan Heights. But yeah, Israel is trying to taking over that so-called neutral territory, which he claims is purely for defensive reasons. The same reason it's bombing like crazy in Syria to try to destroy weapons depots so that they don't fall in the wrong hands. And I can understand the logic of that, but I'm sure from the point of view of al-Shara, it's not seen as a benign gesture. I don't see good relations developing in the future between Syria and Israel, that's for sure.
Yeah, I thought it was quite strange, because as Israel is taking more and more land, Julani is saying we don't have any problems with Israel, we have problems with Iran, which is fine, but Iran's now gone, and Israel, as you talk, is taking over land.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
it says it's just occupying at present, because of the insecurity of the situation. We'll see. I mean, Israel has not had a habit of retreating from any land that is occupied.
yes,
unless they can get a deal, as they did with Egypt with the Sinai. But that's
so we know roughly we know the role that Turkey played, the role that USA played, Israel, Qatar, even Jordan. What was the role of Saudi Arabia in this? Do you think did they have a role in any of this, or how do you see their presence?
I don't know. Right now, they're sitting back and eating popcorn and watching the show.
Yeah, I'm very surprised, actually.
Yeah. Well,
because the Arab League didn't
what
really.
role did they play? I mean, they were never friends of Assad. They were not going to support him. They're obviously, a little nervous about Julani and the HTS and their jihadi background.
Yeah.
It's people like that have always been enemies of the Assad family regime.
Yes.
So I think they're playing a wait and see, and of course their recent attempts to try to forge lines of communication and even cooperation with Israel is probably not something that the new Syrian government will appreciate. So I think Saudi Arabia is trying to figure out. They're trying to, like the rest of us, trying to figure out what's happening,
yeah,
which direction Syria is going, and then how are they going to deal with that? How are they going to fit in with it? So I think, like the U.S. and much of the rest of the world, it's kind of a wait and see.
Yeah, I think Saudi Arabia is going to be nervous. When we had Morsi coming into Egypt, that made Saudi Arabia very nervous, because they don't want to see Muslim Brotherhood type people spreading more and more in the Middle East, because if anything, I think they see that as a threat to their own kingdom. And a lot of these kingdoms do kind of see that as a threat. But I think Saudi Arabia is very clever. I think they're going to wait until they have the the option, a bit like what they did in Egypt, until they can see a clear winner in the situation. I think
No, I
they're
think
just
you're
going to.
absolutely right, and Al-Sisi probably will take the same position in Egypt. To kind
Yeah,
of wait and see what's going to happen.
yeah. How do you
It,
see Russian situation? Do you see this as an actual loss for Russia, or do you think they, despite the fact that they were backing Assad for such a long time, is not they didn't have so much counting in the whole Syrian situation? How do you see?
no, of course, it's a loss for Russia. It's a bigger loss for Iran, of course.
Yes,
It's a catastrophic loss for Iran. They used to have this arc of power, now they don't. That swept through Iraq and Syria down to Hezbollah and Lebanon, and now that the whole left side has been kind of cut off. So it's a huge disaster for Iran, and it's also a great blow to Russia because they had, Syria was their main access to the Mediterranean, and they had a lot of weapons depot, and they were, they played a very strong military role in supporting Syria,
yeah,
and now all of that's gone. So. I mean, obviously, Russia has its hands full with Ukraine, and they have other things to worry about right now. So Syria is a problem, but it's not catastrophic as it is with Iran, but it's certainly a big blow.
yeah. Can you believe even Ukraine had a hand in the whole thing?
I don't know. I don't know what role they would play, but I'm sure they're not displeased,
Yeah,
because if it helps to weaken Russia, that's good for them. Uh,
exactly.
but I don't think they played any role in it. I can't see what they would do.
Do you think that this whole change in the balance of power, at least in Syria, do you think that's going to bring Russia and Iran closer together, or is that kind of one less common factor that they have between each other?
I don't know. I don't think it'll drive them apart, uh, but I don't think it's. Putin is very transactional. There's He only cares about what he can get out of it, and
Yeah,
so uh, right now, if Iran can continue to support um, Russia militarily, obviously he will continue the friendship, and the same with China. China, gets oil from Iran. It doesn't want to do anything to disturb that. I'm sure China's also been watching this with a certain amount of
yes,
apprehension, but it's not going to fundamentally change its relationship with Iran.
yeah. I've heard that Iran's been, even before all of this happened, Iran was getting ready for the new Trump government and trying to prepare what to do if the pressure on China gets too much to stop getting oil from Iran. They were already setting up some kind of a system where they can supply more oil to Russia, and then from there it would go to China. So I think they might still carry on trying to put some of those safeguards in place.
And India's buying
Yes,
a lot of Russian oil, and it would be happy to get oil from Iraq as well.
yeah.
From Iran, excuse me, as well.
I think in all of this, the biggest losers, unfortunately, are Palestine and Hezbollah. How do you see that?
Well, the real problem for Palestine is the elections, and Trump, I think, will basically just give Netanyahu a green light. And Netanyahu has such a strong, kind of this cabal of political parties that supports Netanyahu, includes some very right-wing characters who have visions of a broader Israel. I've interviewed all of these going back to Meir Kahane many years ago. The kind of spokespeople for Eretz Israel vision, that is the idea of recreating biblical Israel from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, which means doing away with the West Bank,
Yeah.
making that part of Israel. It's not clear how the Palestinians would be treated within that territory. But right now, of course, if you look on a map, with the growth of Israeli settlements, there isn't really much West Bank left other than these packed pockets of Palestinian-controlled areas. And so my guess is that that's kind of what they have in mind. It's something like, South Africa before the end of apartheid would have these Bantustans, these various little segments, kind of like Indian reservations in the United States for the local people. So there'll be Indian reservations for the Palestinians in what used to be the West Bank, and they'll simply take the whole thing over. That's my guess. That's the way things are going, and Trump will do nothing to stop it. The Democrat, if Kamala Harris had won, that would be a whole totally different story. But we have now 4 years of an autocratic regime in the United States who love other autocrats. And so he's going to give a green light to Erdogan and Turkey and Netanyahu and Israel and warm up to Putin and Russia. And he's even invited Xi to his inaugural, he hasn't seen an autocrat he hasn't liked, except Iran, interestingly. You would think he would cozy up to the Iranian regime, but he hasn't yet. That's because he's put his money on the Saudis, and that's because he sees oil and he sees money, and that's much more important for him.
So you did touch upon, I was reading one of your recent articles in which you outlined for Julani and the Syrian government 4 or 5 different models of governance.
I was just speculating how it might develop. And, I don't have an answer to that. We'll see. But my guess is that it will be some kind of combination of apparently democratic legislature with a fairly autocratic leadership and a fairly conservative cultural and religious bias to it. I think there will be protection for the minority groups. I think that it couldn't operate without it, and al-Shara has made it clear that the Alawites and Christians and Jews will be protected, and I think they will be, at least to some extent.
Yeah, because the minorities, combined with minorities in Syria, are quite significant, about 30% of the population. I think it's also going to be interesting how ISIS and HRT, both Takfiri groups, try to takfir each other out. I think that's going to be interesting.
He's going to have to confront ISIS, and I think probably he has to squash them militarily. I don't think that there's any easy coalition between the two. ISIS thinks that he's become much too moderate, and I mean, what remains of ISIS thinks he's become much too moderate. They still are licking their wounds from earlier confrontation between al-Nusra and ISIS, and they're not going to easily become accommodated. So I think they'll simply have to be defeated. And I think he's also made that same calculation. But we'll see how that plays out. I mean, it could be like, in the Taliban has this rump group, the disaffected Taliban who claim to be a part of ISIS.
Yes.
The Khorasan group of ISIS, but they are in fact former Taliban who felt that the Taliban has become too moderate. Believe it or not, I mean, it kind of astonishes most of us who think the Taliban is already pretty unmoderate, but they think it should be more rigid. And they're the ones, for example, who killed those soldiers, those American soldiers and Afghanis at the airport as they were leaving, which now has become a major issue of the U.S. election, where Trump accused Biden of letting this happen. Of course, the whole exit from Afghanistan was worked out by Trump. It was a deal that he worked out a year and a half earlier in Doha. And now, it's finally coming to fruition. And at the last minute, there was this attack, which was meant to discredit Taliban, because the Taliban was trying very hard to work with the Americans to make the fake safe passage. It was remarkable. 150,000 people got out of Kabul within just less than 2 weeks. And there's been, I mean, the fall of Vietnam, for example, which was a similar kind of situation.
Yeah.
The Americans got out almost no one. I mean, just a few people they could get on a helicopter as it was leaving the embassy roof. And all of the other Vietnamese who were supporting the Americans got on boats. They were the boat people and managed to flee the country by themselves. But in Afghanistan, they were able to achieve, with the help of the Taliban, the complicity of the Taliban. Taliban just fine, get rid of you. You can go. We'll help you leave. But then this Khorasan group, were trying to discredit the Taliban, and they're the ones who attacked the people who were trying to leave, and also the American soldiers, and they were just angry at the Taliban's cooperation with the American government. And now that's being held against Biden, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
But that was part of the, winning election strategy that Trump used. So we'll see what happens with Syria.
So Trump's coming into office from January, and he's going to be around for 4 years. We've got the war in Ukraine going on. We've got everything kicking off in Syria. We've got Israel's current problems with Palestine, Lebanon, Iran.
Mm-hmm.
We've got Trump's own obsession of confronting China. What do you see for the next 4 years? What's going to be the biggest issue for Trump out of these?
Well, the biggest issue for Trump is going to be how to please all of these autocrats at the same time, because they're it's not as if they were a part of a single club, and even though he would like to feel like he's a part of that club, it's a contentious club, and they each have their own national interests, and he's going to very quickly learn that in trying to promote the national interests of the United States, he's going to come into conflict with the national interests of other countries, beginning with the stupid idea of tariffs. And if it really persists, which would be disastrous for the American economy, because of course it's a tax on American consumers, and will immediately, inflation would just go through the roof, because prices would go up, 25% if it has a tax on everything. But also it'll be, trigger a trade war with China. And then you have this huge, this fierce back and forth with China. And then I don't imagine this honeymoon with Putin lasting forever either. We don't know how Ukraine is going to end. I mean, Trump is basically going to let Putin come in and work out any kind of deal he can. What I think he hopes, what Trump hopes, is at least Kyiv, the capital, and large portions of Ukraine will stay in the hands of the Ukrainians, and they will then be welcomed into the EU, whereas the eastern part of the country will be taken over by Russia. I think that's kind of the solution that Trump has in mind. Now, if Putin is satisfied with that, maybe that will work, but he might want all of Ukraine, which could be a huge problem. I don't think that even the Republican Party has the stomach for that. And certainly Europe doesn't, because, just look on a map. Half of Ukraine sticks into the heart of Europe, and the other half sticks into Russia. And well, you can divide it up. That might work, but taking the whole thing over by Russia, if that's what Putin wants, then if he moves into Poland, who knows what his plans are. So, and then you have North Korea. I mean, you have a whole bundle of potential problems with these autocrats with whom he's so cozy. And at some point, he's going to want to get his European allies, and the Europeans will say, wait a second, you just cut us off for NATO, and now you want to be friends just because you want our military support. We're not so sure. I mean, who knows you can imagine all kinds of awful scenarios as a result of this Trump trying to play this power politics with his autocratic buddies. But there are two larger trends that I think that Syria is emblematic of. And the one is the one we've been talking about, and that is the movement towards authoritarian nationalism, uh, which in some ways is a rejection of the global civil society that is promised by globalization, um, and the kind of uneasiness with national identities in an era of globalization where increasingly everyone can live everywhere, goods are made everywhere, the economies are all knit with each other. And so this is a ripe opportunity to try to shore up the authority of national entities, and that often turns out in an authoritarian way. We've seen that in American elections, of course, but also in Europe with the rise of right-wing parties, and then the Erdogans and the Putins and the Xi's and Modi in India. I mean, around the world, there's a move towards authoritarian regime, and and I think Syria is example both of the end of a certain kind of authoritarianism with the end of Bashar al-Assad. That's often the way in which authoritarian government ends, but the possible rise of a new one. And so that's what we have to look at and see what is going to happen. But I strongly imagine that there will be a fairly authoritarian bent to this government, in part because of al-Shara's predilections, the way he's ruled Idlib and the way he's been in the past, uh, but also the need for some kind of strong, unified presence to pull the country together. So I think that's one sort of global tendency that Syria fits into, and the other is the religionization of politics. And the role that religion has played, I think, again, because of the forces of globalization, where the whole idea of national communities based on geographical communities and geographical societies just doesn't work in a global era where everybody can live everywhere and there's this vast demographic shift in the mobility of peoples. And if not physically, at least through the internet and through connections. And, we live in a globalized world. So then to, to give some sense of national identity, to answer the question, who are we as a national unit, then often religion comes roaring back in a way that celebrates a majority religion and marginalizes the minority religions. I've been watching in India to see this happen with some dread, as increasingly the Hinduization of the government means that the large 15% Muslim minority in India feels increasingly marginalized. And whole periods of Indian history seem to be kind of wiped out of the books, literally in textbooks. The whole Mughal rule, was an aberration. It didn't exist. Well, come on, this is part of India's proud heritage. Go and look at the Taj Mahal. But it's a part of this sense of who we are as a people that want to lay claim to this identity. It's of course a huge feature of American politics. Increasingly, liberal Protestant churches, the kind of thing that I grew up with as a liberal Protestant and Christian in the United States, are fading away. And people like me are kind of afraid to call ourselves Christian because we're afraid that we'll be identified with those MAGA evangelicals who are extremist right wing, who believe everything except what Jesus taught about loving your neighbor and helping the poor and taking care of the stranger. All of these things that are part of the gospel readings somehow has been discarded for a much more rigid kind of authoritarian religiosity. So this is happening around the world. It's a feature of virtually every strong centralist, semi-authoritarian or authoritarian government to use religion as a way of shoring up the credibility and the identity of an authoritarian nationalist community. So those two things, I think, are very much a part of the Syrian situation, and will continue to be so. We don't know what kind of role the conservative religious ideology of al-Nusra will play in the new government, but I don't think it will vanish. I think it will be there in some form, and we'll just have to see how it plays out and to what degree the minority communities, the Alawites, the Christians, the Druze, still feel welcomed within the country, and of course, ethnic groups like the Kurds in the east. So we'll see in the north. We'll see.
Yeah, very interesting. Because just touching upon some of the things that you mentioned. First of all, personally, I don't think Putin's going to want to take over all of Ukraine, because the European part of Ukraine, I don't think he's interested in, or he.
Well, he wants Kyiv. He wants
I'm
Kyiv.
sorry.
He wants Kyiv, the capital.
Yes,
Mm.
I think he doesn't think he can control the European part. It's not Russian by ethnicity, culture, so he's going to find it very problematic. He's definitely going to want to keep the areas that he's got under his control, but I think for Trump, it's going to be very difficult to have a negotiation where Putin gets to keep all of those areas that he's got under his belt, and then Trump's somehow still able to portray that as a success for his negotiation skills. Um, the other thing is that I think what you're saying about authoritarianism is absolutely right. I know in Pakistan, a lot of Pakistanis listening to me right now are going to be very offended, but even Imran Khan was the next up and coming authoritarian in Pakistan. He's ended up in prison, but
And
when
the
he gets out, so I think that's definitely the trend over there as well. Um,
well, Pakistan throughout its political history has kind of traded
yes,
back and forth between coups, between a democratic elected government and then the al-Mashars and
yes.
the various.
But normally we have like military dictators.
Yes,
Now, after Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, I think this is the first kind of civilian authoritarian we're about to get.
yeah.
Um, Also, I think it is interesting what you're saying about like increased religiosity, but not like positive religiosity, but it's like negative, divisive.
Nativist religiosity, yeah, and you can see this in Pakistan also with the heresy,
Yes,
for example, which
and it's
are
global. Why do you think that is? Is it part of maybe decolonization? Is it like people looking at some imaginary past that didn't exist quite there, but they're trying to kind of exaggerate it?
well, I think that's part of it, but I think you have to put it in the present context of globalization, uh, because that term which we were so enamored with in the 90s is signifying, oh, may the world is getting better. I think is still with us, but it's with us now in a negative way as an incentive to try to shore up national identities in the face of a changing world, in which increasingly there isn't the kind of basis for accountability or identity or authority that traditional national entities provided. And so we have on the one hand, a celebration of this kind of global citizenship, and the other hand, a sheer panic that we're we're being lost, we're disappearing. I remember, I work on religious violence and religious nationalism, as you know, in different parts of the world. I go around and talk with people who are involved in these movements, and I was once in Myanmar at the city of Mandalay talking with Ajahn Waratu, who is the Buddhist monk who is behind of these attacks on the Muslim, particularly the Rohingya people in the northwestern part of the country. And I was kind of puzzled, first of all, how Buddhism could
Yes.
justify violence. And he kept on saying, "Oh, we're Buddhists, we're nonviolent." I said, "Yes, yes." And then I said, "But you do think that Buddhists have the right to defend themselves?" "Yes," he said very quickly. I said, "Defend." I said, now we're getting somewhere. Defend ourselves against whom? He says, "Against those enemies of Buddhism." And I said, "Well, who are those people?" He said, "Oh, those Muslims. They're trying to get us. They're trying to defeat Islam." And look, he says, and then he showed a map. He says this huge wash, it was all colored, different colors, huge wash of red. That was the Muslim world, and that was sort of threatening the whole of the world. And this tiny little blob of blue, which was not just Buddhism, but Burmese Buddhism, which he thought was a very special kind of Buddhism.
Yeah.
And he said, look, we're being surrounded and we're in peril of being forever banished and taken away. Well, there's only a small minority of Muslims in Myanmar, and they're certainly not threatening control of the country. but in his imagination, and of course the kind of pumped up imagination of those people who had been riling up in order to attack the Muslims, there was this fear that, oh, the Muslims are out to get us and we have to protect ourselves. We have to defend, what's left of Burmese Buddhist nationality. And I think this is kind of emblematic of what's going on around the world. The feeling that and Murano, by the way, was fascinated with global events. It was just, his eyes were glued to the television with things that were going on around the world. It's like the people in the United States who watch Fox News constantly.
Yeah.
This has become their entertainment. And on the left as well, I have to admit, there's this 24/7 news cycles where news is entertainment and ideological news has become the kind of the name of the game, that you promote a certain kind of pattern or way of thinking. And in that those spins and those kind of echo chamber worlds that are created by social media and by the slanted television news services, that we live in an imperial world. We have to defend ourselves. There are these horrible things happening, and they're trying to get us. They're trying to destroy us, our community, our way of life. I mean, no matter that, in the United States, it's always been an integrated country. It's never been, they want to go back to the Christian past. The United States didn't have a Christian past. It was founded by people who were deists. They were not Christian. They rejected the religiosity of the clerics and the formal church. They just believed in a kind of spiritual force in nature. Imagine that there was a Christian past, and this is all part of a kind of game, in a sense, to justify the marginalization of people you don't like and you feel that are not really should not be heirs to the American people. That's the reason why all of this attempts to try to manipulate the elections to get rid of those people that the Trump people think shouldn't have the right to vote. The people who are really not valid inheritors of the American that they know, or at least they imagine as being part of the past. And that means particularly, recent refugees and immigrants who they think are not a part of the true American heritage. Well, that's nonsense, of course. I mean, this whole tradition of the United States has been welcoming different waves. I mean, assimilating different, initially not welcoming them at all. I mean, the Italians and the Irish, they were treated like dirt until then they became a part of the fabric of American society. But they've forgotten all of that. And now they're, once again, trying to revive the idea that there was a purity of the past. And this is happening around the world. It's not an American phenomenon. It's not an Indian phenomenon. It's not a Turkish phenomenon. But the same kind of thing is happening in not a Pakistani problem. And even in China, there's an attempt to try to Hanify the Uyghur people in the West, to make them into good Chinese, which means like the Han ethnic community of the East that kind of dominates Chinese culture. And I've been to Kashgar, I've been to the West, and these are people who are actually closer to Islamabad than they are to Beijing.
Yes.
And they're closer to Islamabad in other ways as well, in terms of religion and language. They speak a kind of Turkish, Central Asian dialect, and of course they're Muslim. I went out there with one of my students who had been studying Chinese, and he said, my Chinese is better than theirs, and it's true. But now they're in these re-education camps, being forced to try to become, Han Chinese, whether they like it or not, and most of them don't like it at all. So this is going around. This is the world. We live in this world right now of response to globalization. I still hold out a modicum of hope that this is not the future of the world, that we will move beyond this and we begin to see ourselves as a potential global community and find ways of organizing and governing ourselves as a global community. But right now we're going through the birth pains of that, whatever that new reality is. if we manage to survive on this planet long enough for it to happen.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting because I've been posing this question to almost every guest, saying that, like, why is it that, like, every country, whether it's Iran, Egypt, America, UK, the divisions between citizens is getting wider and wider, the schism. Both sides see each other not just as like a difference of opinion, but we see each other as traitors or less like takfiri, whether it's in religious terms or unpatriotic. And I think that makes a lot of sense what you're saying, putting it in that
Yeah, it's a
context.
global problem, and it's a problem in part because of globalization, augmented with the nature of the media that we have and the social networks that really reinforce whatever we want to believe and make us think that that's the way the world is and that's what everybody believes. That's we live in side by side with people who experience the world totally different than we do just because of their sources of information.
Yeah.
But thank God for podcasts like yours that I hope inform people and broaden their minds.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think it's going to be very interesting to see where we end up in the next 4 years with Trump coming in, but also Putin and China and the BRICS kind of getting closer together, and possible more kind of conflict, cold or hot. So I think the next 4 years are going to be quite telling.
Yes, and I hope we still planet. Of course, we deal with the ravages of global warming. And that may, as this becomes much more acute, this may divert the attention of all of us. And perhaps, I mean, it could do two things, and they're contradictory. It could force us to work together as a global community to confront this global problem. Or it could make people even more defensive about their little narrow turf of space and want to protect that as the ravages of fire and flood and levels, the change of the temperatures are. So I think that's going to be an issue for all of us.
Yeah. Okay, Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time you've given us and the knowledge you're able to share with us. Do you have any, before we leave, do you have any last words that you want to convey?
I'm a kind of realistic, pessimistic optimist. So despite my kind of somewhat dark assessment of the way the world is now and will be for, unfortunately, the foreseeable few years, I still hold out a modicum of hope that we as a moral community on this planet can rise to the common problems that all of us face and work together as a global community. That's my hope for the future, and I'm still going to cling to it, regardless of the reality of what's happening in front of our faces.
Thank you. Thank you so much.